Hello, Bookstew viewers and listeners. So before today's show started, Maria, my director, said, well, how do you describe this book? And I was like flummoxed. How do I describe this book? The book is fiction. It's a bit dystopian and transformative, and yet it's chock full of good old boys and the South. So it's really like a melange of a lot of interesting themes. So I'd like to introduce you to Jeremy T. Wilson, the author of The Quail Who Wears the Shirt. Welcome to Bookstew, Jeremy.
Thank you so much for having me.
So we'll have to start immediately with Quail. Like, other than, we were talking about cartoons before, I know there's like a Looney Tune that has a bunch of quails running around in it, and they make funny noises and they have feathers coming out of their heads. But I think there was just one, and I don't remember much about it. So where did the idea of featuring quails, and you'll have to explain a little bit about what happens to the quails or what happens to the humans in relation to quails for the audience.
Yeah, so what's happening is that for about 15 years or so, people have been mysteriously turning into quails, not like full on birds where they like shrink in size and fly away, but they start to develop quail properties. So their bodies change shapes and they get, like you said, the plume coming out of the top of their head. Their faces sort of elongate. Some of them, look like they have beaks. So they're sort of changing their bodies transformatively in significant ways. But nobody knows why it's happening, and it's happening everywhere. So the people begin to sort of get ostracized by the larger community in certain places because no one knows how they might get it or what these people are all about. So certain rumors develop about them and about their abilities and what they are and how you might get it. So that's the setup for what's going on here. Now, how it came to me, I have no idea. I've of course been asked this question a lot. I was working on a story that was similar. And it did not have any fantastic elements in it at all. And it just wasn't working. And a lot of times in my process, I will throw in fantastic or fabulous or speculative elements into a story when I'm stuck, just to sort of like see what happens. They don't always stay in the story. And so that was what I did. And it came to me because I woke up one morning and I wrote quail people in my phone, in my notes app. I don't know if I was dreaming about quail people or if or what, but that's where it came from. And so the next time I sat down to write and to work on that, I put them in there, and then it became a lot more fun. And I sort of like redeveloped the whole thing around this idea.
Well, it's interesting how because I think I was maybe 20 or 25 pages into it before I actually understood that it was humans who were becoming quails. And since it's been going on for a while, nobody seems to be really surprised by it. They seem to be accepting of it, which I thought was really strange. But I guess, people aren't turning into like fierce tigers or creepy snakes or something. They're turning into a really benevolent, and I don't think we know a lot about generally animals. So I think it was easy to accept. And there was also not really an environmental take on it. So I thought maybe, okay, something, as I was reading, I was expecting something to come out that said, oh, it was because there were quail eggs in the water or something like that. So you leave it as a complete mystery as to how and why this happens, which I thought was good, because I don't even know how even with an imagination as active as yours, I don't know how you'd come up with an explanation for it. But I wanted to say that what it reminded me of was Tom Perrotta's book, The Leftovers, which was also, I think, an HBO series about people who got raptured, but not everybody got raptured, and there was no reason why people seemed, it wasn't all the religious people who got picked to get raptured. But it did remind me of that. I thought it had like a kind of humor like Tom Perrotta had, and another instance where there was no explanation for why it happened, it just happened. But the other really strong element in here is the South, and a specific area in the South, and an area that it sounds like from your biography you grew up in. So do you want to tell us a little bit about your main character and the setting?
Yeah, there was I want to go back to just really quickly to something you said in there. Like the reason, like another reason why quails were an attractive choice, if I even had a choice in the matter, was because they are benign, right? They're not tigers, like you said, which would be really, really scary. So it is much more of a type of situation where where even though they're sort of ostracized, they can still integrate into the community really well, and like people just exist alongside them. The thing that's great about, like, I love that, I didn't see the series, but I did read the book. And one of the things that's essential about that book is that it's much more about what happens after the event than it is the event, right? And a lot of times, this is something I talk about with my students a lot, especially the younger students who are bent on creating stories that are about an event, and then they become sensationalized. And so it's much less about the characters involved and much more about like the thing that happens. But I think as readers and writers, like we're much more interested in like what happens to the people. And so I didn't have that novel in mind, but I was attracted to this idea of like what happens afterwards, which is why I wanted to make it so far after these things have been happening. So as far as the South is concerned, yeah, I grew up in Georgia. This is a made-up place. There is no town named Charity in Georgia that I know of. Maybe there has been one invented since I wrote this, but I don't think so. And yeah, so I grew up there, but I haven't lived there in over 20 years. I moved to Chicago in 2001. So I think a lot of writers write better about a place when they have left there, and that was something that is very much true for my experience. And yeah, so I just set it there because I knew the place, and I really like. I'm not a big fan of research. Maybe that's clear in reading the book. I would much rather invent stuff than have to research things, and so for me, it's much easier in the writing process to get the words out if I'm familiar with the place where it's set and the people who are involved. Then I can just write, and then I can go back and do research as necessary. But it's much more about like I can move forward if I am among things that I'm experienced with.
Well, I thought the main character, and this is in first person, is Lee Hubbs, who has inherited, and one of my favorite parts was the fact that he owns like a produce farm, but the description of how it just was this close to being Vidalia onions and wasn't Vidalia onions was really hilarious, because, you know, if you had to ask, like do a Mad Libs and you had blank onions, you would put probably Vidalia onions in there, but you had a different type of onion, and yet Lee, based on what he inherited from his family, was able to set up the type of place in Georgia where, you know, if you ever drove from New York to Florida, which I did when I was a kid, and if it wasn't a Stuckey's, then it was, you know, some roadside place, and if you weren't on an interstate, it was just like the only place you could stop, and you needed water and you needed to go to the bathroom. And then you'd go into these places that kind of looked shabby on the outside, and there'd be these fantastic things going on in there, and baked goods you'd never seen, and vegetables you weren't familiar with. So I think you caught that atmosphere really well, and you described that there was nowhere basically in between nowhere else to stop along the way on that drive. And I just thought you caught the feeling of that place very well. And I don't know if people even know it anymore because, I'm old enough to have remembered when there weren't interstates to get to, down the East Coast on.
Yeah, it's that is again something that's familiar to me. When I grew up, one of the earliest jobs I had was working at a peach stand that was outside of a gas station, and it was basically just a trailer where we sold peaches and whatever came in the summer, peaches, watermelons, onions, and it was great. I loved it. And then as I got older, I had another job after college that was much more that was at a place that was much more like this, in the sense that it was bigger. They had an inside and an outside and all that sort of thing. So, but yeah, I mean, these types of places, I guess you're right. Maybe they are few and far between now. I mean, as they get replaced by like these giant superstores like Buc-ee's and stuff. Are you familiar with Buc-ee's? Have you ever
I
been
have
in?
heard of it, though. I have never been to one, but I hear all the time about how they have like some great stuff you buy there, junky food, and it's like the place to stop.
It's unbelievable. But in some ways it's kind of a tragedy, right? Because like, you know, people, they have signs all up and down the interstate. It's like next Buc-ee's is 100 and so miles or whatever. So it becomes like this thing where I'm not going to stop at any of these local places because I'm going to go to this giant thing where I know I can get, barbecue and like beaver nuggets or whatever they're called. I don't even know. But
So Lee is, when we meet him, is not really in a great place. He's having marital problems, and I think the character who is the quail who wears the shirt enters his life in just rides into town on a bicycle and seems to be a very amiable quail person. And then, unfortunately, Lee has a bad encounter with him out on the road, on a dark road, and then everything tumbles after that. And Lee's whole life is turned completely upside down with his family leaves him, and he is responsible for what happened to the quail. And then he just decides to do some investigating about who was this quail who rode into town. So why don't you tell us a little bit about the quail and the elements of him that made him so fascinating to Lee?
Well, what makes him originally so fascinating to Lee is that in order for him, well, he has this sort of magical thinking, right? He thinks that, well, I did this horrible thing. I got away with it. But this is the reason that my life is falling apart. And so if I can make amends somehow, then my life will be put back together. Okay, so this is his belief. And so his interest in Valentine, who's the name of the quail, is purely selfish. But as he goes along and finds out more and more about him, he becomes more aware of the type of life that Valentine had led. And it wasn't a great one. And so he then becomes more interested in him as a person throughout the journey. And what he's trying to do, he thinks that all he has to do to absolve himself from this is to find someone who loved Valentine, tell them that he was sorry, and give them an onion pie. Because this is the thing that his father would always do when anyone in the community passed away. He would make an onion pie and give it to them. But he thinks this is all he has to do. So that's what he tries to do. And as you know, as he finds out more and more, things don't go as planned.
Well, one of the other elements that I really enjoyed was the contrast between Lee and the high school kids or younger kids who worked at the stand. So there was AJ and Ben and Jody. And Jody is a girl, and she was a source of the marital issues. But AJ and Ben are beautifully drawn characters, and I'm wondering if they come from the fact that you teach creative writing at the high school for the arts, in Chicago High School for the Arts. I mean, I'm not saying you have individual students you base them on, but have you been teaching long enough to really, like, you must be, to be able to take some qualities from these students and to bring characters to life like that?
Yeah, definitely. I'm glad to hear you say that about those characters. Thank you. I mean, I put a lot into them. Yeah, I mean, I put a lot into most of the characters, so that seems weird to say. But like, I did want them to be more than just kind of stock high school characters in some way. And I do think that is a direct experience of me having worked with high school students for the past 10 years. I didn't really base them on anyone specifically, but I do think that some of the things that they're talking about as far as identity and as far as wanting to belong and as far as like playing around with different ideas of who they are and what they want to become and sort of a mistrust of adults, all that stuff is very familiar to me working with teenagers. And I don't think that's new. I mean, everything I just listed would have been true for teenagers in the 90s or the 70s or the 50s or whatever.
Well, with the added misery of social media, but I think that the combination of small town and almost universal teenagers, but yet I think there was something a little more creative about all three of them. They were kind of meatier. They weren't, like you say, they weren't like cardboard cutouts of kids. So, and also Valentine, who Valentine turns out to be, which I'm not going to reveal, was a fascinating evolution from somebody who just seemed like kind of a silly character whose life didn't appear to have much meaning. And then the more Lee learns about him, the backstory is very affecting. And also, Lee meets his sister and his mother, and I thought that was all very well done and kind of touching. And Lee, in his journey, becomes a little less despicable than he is when we start out, because when we start out, he's just some good old boy who's cheating on his wife and taking advantage of one of his employees. And I think his search for Valentine, the meaning of Valentine's life, really makes a difference for him. But he's still not Mr. Wonderful per se. There's still a lot that's really annoying about him. Did you have a hard time keeping him balanced as a character? Because you don't want to go too far. You don't want to make him turn into an angel as a result of it. But so I guess how did you feel about the evolution of your main character?
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, like the question of redemption can't come too easily. I feel like that would strike me as false, and I think would strike the reader as false, especially with someone like Lee. But I do think that the opposite is also true in the sense that, like, if he is too far gone, if he is like become sort of a ridiculous bad guy, then we also are in territory where the reader is like, not going to be that interested because he's just so incredibly awful. And so I think there was, as I was writing this, there were times where I was conscious of backing off of his ridiculousness. I mean, it all started because I wanted to write someone who I wouldn't necessarily, whose thoughts and opinions I wouldn't necessarily agree with. And starting from that and using that as a starting point, it just was really fun. But what you've got to do is you can't make fun, right? I couldn't make fun of him. I'm definitely poking fun at some of the things he does. Obviously, it's a satire, but I still earnestly believed in him as a character and as a person, which that was the thing that I had to believe in order to write towards this idea of redemption.
I think there was a lot of gentle fun being poked at most of the characters, except maybe the three kids that we met. His in-laws were kind of ridiculous people. And then his relationship with his brother was definitely one of the high points. You know, he has an estranged brother, and then he needs help from his brother, and they have an encounter again, that was almost my favorite part of the book. But I'm going to ask you to do a short reading if you wouldn't mind, and with the setup, maybe people will understand more about what we're talking about when we talk about Lee and onions and quails.
Yeah, so the part that I'm going to read from doesn't really have any quail people in it, but it is much more about the what we were talking about earlier about the produce stand and the I mean it's not, it's more than a stand, it's a market, right? It's big enough, it has a parking lot and all this kind of stuff. So this is just sort of kind of a description of the place and how he feels about it, or how he thinks other people think about the place. That's more accurate. And so what he's done is he's midway through his journey trying to find out things about Valentine and hasn't had much luck doing so. And so he's coming back to work at the end of like a morning trying to find some things out about him. And this is from a chapter called Only Love Can Break Your Heart. The afternoon got busy, picking up with weekend traffic. The sheer number of travelers any given weekend during the summer was heartening for a small business proprietor. All these people cruising up and down I-75 in their cars and trucks and SUVs and motor coaches, all headed to and from the Sunshine State. Because everybody knows there's not one destination in the southern half of Georgia between Charity and the Florida line. Kids watching movies from the back seat. Dads drinking light beer in the front, promising themselves they only have one more. Moms knitting or reading trashy magazines or wondering where they might have gone wrong in their life to be hurtling down the highway in a car they can't afford, with kids they can't stand, to a state that's no fun. And what do we do here at Hub's Fresh Produce? We add a little light to these lives, a beacon of blessed fruit in the highway wilderness. Stop in for fresh homemade peach ice cream and some southern hospitality and catch your breath. Peruse the aisles of summer harvest, the colors almost popping your eyes out with intensity. Would you like to try a boiled peanut? A what? A boiled peanut, a goober pea. It's a delicacy, warm and salty on the tongue. Mmm. How about a painting of an old Coca-Cola sign rusting on the side of a filling station? You like decrepit landscapes? We got that. Floral patterned picnic baskets, monogrammed beach towels, scuppernong wine. Come on in. Have a seat out front in one of the white rocking chairs and fan yourself with one of our custom I'm a Hubs fan fans, while the juice from a slice of fresh watermelon drips down your fingers. You can transport yourself to another time, a simpler time. It's a lot for a produce market to do, but we offer the taste of a memory, living history, a hokey vision of a falsely idealized past. In the fall, you should see how high we stack the cotton. So the day got away from me, and with it my determination to find someone who deserved an onion pie. This is what work is for when it's good, to keep us from the thoughts that would otherwise break us down, cripple us with self-doubt, self-reflection, self-awareness. We work so we don't have to work on ourselves.
It almost makes it like a place that you do want to stop. You know, it's very evocative, and I think you're able to pack a lot of images into what's in Lee's head. You know, I think there's almost more in the descriptions than there is in the dialogue. You know, more of his internal thoughts. But I would like to ask you, I had two readings in mind, and you chose one, but the other one that I so enjoyed was the description of how his brother deals with TV. So can you just give us a description of that? You don't have to do the reading, but I thought the whole concept was fascinating.
Yeah, so his brother comes up with this thing that he calls a happiness quotient. And he determines it by flipping through all of the channels on the television and seeing who he would want to trade places with. And And so if it's really high, if he gets a number of people that he wants to trade places with, he's not in a good spot. So he tells Lee about this theory, and Lee's like, "This is ridiculous." Um, but there is, of course, the scene you're talking about. Lee ends up doing it himself, um, and I won't tell you how many people he wants to switch with.
So, I mean, is that something you'd been thinking about for a while, or did it pop? Because I think the idea was it just stopped me in my place while I was reading. I said, wait a minute, I got to read this over again, because this is such an amazing thought for anyone to even have.
You didn't do it, did you? You didn't go home and like flip through your channels. Well, the thing is, he also says like nobody watches TV like that anymore. So it's also like an indication of like their age and kind of like the way that they consume media. But I haven't done it personally. I have no idea what my score would be.
So it just kind of came into your head to the idea to do something like that.
Yeah, yeah, it really did. It just seemed like something that yeah, I think Pierce is his brother's name. It just seemed like something his character would come up with. You
But
know?
it's something that you came up with, which I think it was so just unique to me. There's a lot of uniqueness in this book. There's a lot that I hadn't thought about or read before, which kind of makes it hard to describe in a way, because there's so many pieces in here. And are you going to have any imagination left for another book? Are you going to plan to write another novel?
Yeah, I'm working on another novel right now. I mean, it's not. I guess it's similar to this one. I'm not sure. Um, but yeah, thank you. I think I think a lot of that just comes from I want to have fun when I'm writing. I don't want it to necessarily be something that is um, difficult. I mean, there can be difficult things about it, of course, but I'm talking mostly about the original creation of the idea and the original writing. That I want to be fun, and so I think that's why sometimes you get all of this stuff thrown in, because I'm just trying to create an atmosphere where I want to come back to the page the next day. Um, but I want to return really quickly to something. As I was reading this, I was thinking about his relationship to the South. And this is a very unique sort of thing, I think, that the South likes to market itself as the South, right? And that can mean any number of things. But at the same time, the people who market that don't always necessarily believe in it. So there is a conflicted relationship that a lot of people in the South have with this creation of this place. And personally, I have it, even though I don't live there anymore. And Lee is also questioning it at that moment as well. It's like, what are we really doing here? How authentic is it? What is real about this place that we live in?
Well, yeah, that all came through. But we're out of time. But I want to thank you for coming in during your lunch hour. You're still teaching, and I really appreciate it. And just one last question: would you give this to your students to read? I mean, because I think most authors I speak to who are teaching writing, or they're teaching adults. They're not teaching kids. Are they curious? Do they know that this book came out? And
they do know. It has made an appearance in my classroom, but I have not done anything to make that happen. So a student brought it in one day and was like, "Hey, here's your book," and I just kind of like move on. I think it's important for them to know that the people who are teaching them are also writers, and they're working writers, in the sense that they're teaching, but we're also continuing to write. But I think it's also important for them to know that like the people who were engaged in this are not all dead, right? The writing is very much alive, and to be a writer means being part of a larger community that still very much exists. And so I definitely like that they know that it's there, and if they want to read it, that's fine. And if they have questions, that's fine. But it's not anything that I would use to teach anything that I'm teaching. I don't ever really use anything of my own to do that.
Well, I can understand why you wouldn't, but I think the scene with the TV would be a great one to share with them. But I'll leave that up to you. So thank you so much for joining me today. This is a really unique book that I'm going to recommend highly to everybody. It was just an unexpected joy because I had no idea what to expect, and as I was reading it, I still had no idea what to expect. So I think you've done a really great job.
Well, thank you so much. That means a ton. I mean, it's like, you know, it's from a small independent press here in Chicago, and so a lot of times it's hard for these things to get noticed out there with all of the books. So it's wonderful that, you know, that you asked me to come on here and that you had such great things to say about it. I'm so glad you enjoyed it. Thank you.
I really did. Thanks. So, Book Stew viewers and listeners, I'm going to push this book on you. I push most books on you, but this one more than most, I guess, because it's not coming from a major press, and you know, you may not read anything about it in the Sunday New York Times Book Review, but it's The Quail Who Wears the Shirt, and it's by Jeremy T. Wilson. Please look for it. I'm sure you can find it on Amazon and maybe some really cool bookstores. And thanks, and have a good night.